it sounds like there is a manifesto which was written by the shooter. And that manifesto being rooted in incel, misogynistic beliefs, something that was really dense as we covered. I tried to kind of look over whatever was maybe a copy of this manifesto, and it was really hard to follow. Well, once I saw that, then sort of my attention was really opening up to this event because it reminded me so much of the Elliot Rodgers shooting in California, like these shootings that are charged by a targeted violence against women. And so that is something that I'm honestly myself still chewing over. And I appreciate having this conversation because it's so layered in itself. And earlier you had asked me a question, like what would I maybe say to someone such as the shooter from a month ago in Côte-des-Neiges? And it's a tricky question because I don't know. I don't know.
A quick content warning for today's episode. We discuss shootings, suicide, violent, misogynistic violence. We are 1 month out from the shooting that happened in Côte-des-Neiges on June 22nd. What some people are calling the incel shooting, an act of misogynistic terror carried out by a 25-year-old man from Lethbridge, Alberta, who drove to Montreal in an attempt to kill the PornHub CEO. There are many things to understand about this shooting. There's lots of conflicting reports coming out that have come out about it closer to the event. We're around a month out when this episode comes out, and I wanted to speak to Spencer, the socialdynamicsnerd. Spencer has sort of worked with, I'd say, people who are adjacent to the male loneliness epidemic. Spencer has been in and out of the pickup artistry world. And I think, there's a lot of opinions that people have about pickup artists, PUAs as they're also known. Spencer notably is one of the only women who has been working as a sort of pickup artist helper, but I want to say she does it in a way that is miles healthier than these other people of the manosphere. I was curious about what Spencer thought about the shooting, about Seth Hatfield's manifesto, if we can call it that. I found today's discussion helpful. It helped me understand a little more about the kind of incel movement that is unfortunately still producing this kind of violence towards women. And hopefully you, the audience, can use this episode to understand it a little more. Here's the conversation. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Colton Dansiba, the host of Local 514, Montreal news from a radically different perspective. Today, we are just over a month out from the deadly Côte-des-Neiges shooting. There's a lot of pieces to this story that I think defy easy explanation. On one hand, this incel manifesto, some outlets claiming that this was an act of anti-Zionist or left-wing terrorism. Other pieces by Nora Loreto and Tula Dumonis talking about or reframing it as sort of misogynistic terrorism. Nora's piece, which kind of gets into his manifesto, which is in itself just a kind of a tome. It's very dense, as Spencer and I were discussing before the show. There's just, this is all to say there's a lot to unpack here. And I think a month out, we have some distance from the event, from the tragedy, that we can start to build some kind of understanding around it. I've been kind of grappling with some of these narratives around it. As I know, our guest today, Spencer, the social dynamics nerd, has been, I think, curious about it and trying to understand in your own ways. And that's sort of why I brought on our guest today to have you share your perspectives and see if we can make sense of this tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my perspective is mostly based on having worked, for better and for worse, many years behind the scenes of what was once the world's largest pickup artist company, which sometimes we call pickup artistry PUA. So if I ever say PUA, that's what it means. And what I find to be really interesting from like the behind the scenes perspective of all my years having seen that is how when it comes to inceldom, incels, and what are incels? Incels are largely disenfranchised men who feel like their problems stem from not being able to get women. Strong framing on get women, because
air
even
quotes.
even this framing in itself is very toxic. But what I find really interesting in my experience is knowing that a lot of the guys I've met through PUA are guys who kind of had a choice through their own Google searches, or I guess nowadays it'd probably be like a TikTok search or what have you, of trying to solve this problem. And you could go down different paths depending on what results appear for you. Is it going to be the inceldom, the dark corners of men basically being mean to each other about their situation? Or is it going to be the male support groups, which in everything I saw in the years that they were active, the pickup artists were unfortunately like some of the best male support groups I ever witnessed as an outsider point of view. And I appreciate that that has existed and that I even got to participate in the good of this. But I also always felt sad that this was the lesser of evils, like the best that I saw, other than probably just guys participating in like a sport together.
The best being this pickup artist agency.
At the time, the best resource for men who feel like they don't have control on their self-esteem, their status, like their social status, and how others react to them, but specifically women. And that this was at least a support group of sorts that would allow guys to connect with other guys and like relate on this subject and actually share mostly proactive tools for becoming a more attractive person, which is the angle I was always the most drawn to with this stuff. Is becoming a more attractive person really stems from what's happening on the inside. And that's also what's interesting is like the incel communities really had sort of like a war against the PUA communities because it's the antithesis of their cultures. Right. The incels are largely in belief that they have no control, that there is no control, hence involuntary celibate is actually where the word incel comes from. Whereas the guys who are subscribing to the narratives of pickup artistry, they're actually believing that there is a way to make these connections happen. When I left this community in 2019, I knew that this was like the most broken solution, is just trying to profit off of men's insecurities in order to give them some sense of being able to attract women, but it still had its weak points. I don't claim to know the solution, but that's definitely where my special interest comes from, is how disenfranchised men can go down these different paths. And something like how to get women is maybe like the lesser of all evils. Sure. When it's coming from a self-help angle.
Right. I think there's so much for us to explain to our audience, right? And I think you began doing that by talking about what inceldom is, how it relates to the pickup artist community. And also, I think it's important to know that these are two kind of subsets of like a larger sort of manosphere.
I call it the manosphere.
Yes. Yeah. That's a very popular term. I think a lot of people are talking about it. To me, it was sort of a thing I associate more with like the mid 2010s, and it feels like it sort of died down. But then now here we are, kind of like after this like tragedy, talking about it again. I kind of want to take us back to June 22nd. You know, I think as the news is coming out, myself, the other journalists here at Local 514, we were in office doing our journalism meeting, and then we get the security notification, the emergency alert on our phones, and we're just trying to understand what was going on. And there's a bunch of conflicting reports at the start of it. But I'm kind of curious what your first thoughts were as this was kind of unfolding.
My first thoughts were definitely like anyone else who got that notification on our phones, just, whoa, what is happening? Also, it's not something that's so common in Montreal that you don't, of course, gun violence is probably happening in different corners of the island. But when it comes to active shooter notifications, this is not something that we see or experience often in our city. So that was shocking. And I was immediately looking it up, what's going on, Côte-des-Neiges. Of course, there were the assumptions that this was like maybe a racially charged activity, which I was believing also, like given the neighborhood, given just this world and the narratives that are very pervasive for people. But then within 24 hours, when we had it revealed that maybe probably it sounds like there is a manifesto which was written by the shooter, and that manifesto being rooted in incel misogynistic beliefs, something that was really dense as we covered. I tried to kind of look over whatever was maybe a copy of this manifesto, and it was really hard to follow. Well, once I saw that, then sort of my attention was really opening up to this event because it reminded me so much of the Elliot Rodger shooting in California, like these shootings that are charged by a targeted violence against women. And so that is something that I'm honestly myself still chewing over. And I appreciate having this conversation because it's so layered in itself. And earlier you had asked me a question, like what would I maybe say to someone such as the shooter from a month ago in Côte-des-Neiges? And it's a tricky question because I don't know. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think it's important to kind of lay out what we do know so far about this event. So the shooter, originally a 25-year-old man from Lethbridge, Alberta, drove across the country and came to Montreal, not necessarily to shoot women. Like it wasn't this kind of like, it wasn't like this kind of polytechnic misogynistic shooting, but it was still like so much of the screed that he wrote had this sort of like anti misogynistic sort of slant to it. But his actual plans were to come to Montreal and then kill the PornHub CEO, right? And so then that I feel like also unveils a whole other topic of conversations, this whole other subset of conversations around pornography, its place in the manosphere, how different people approach it. And I think there's also like, this is for like maybe another conversation, but about the history of that kind of like industry here in Montreal, right? Because that's been kind of a long time industry brewing here in Montreal that used to be Montreal used to be called Sin City. It used to be this home for like almost like a Vegas in Quebec, where it was like strip clubs everywhere, and that kind of became this other industry of pornography. But I mean, we're not going to get into that right now, but so adding on to those important details, there's supposedly this 104-page document that he wrote. The one that seems to be available was the one published by Rebel News, very right-wing media. It's just, I mean, you'll see them in the news all the time. We talk about them a lot, not because we want to, but because they just sort of force a conversation, I guess. And there's a lot of, I think, thoughts I have about them publishing this. They've published like a 32, 34-page version of it, which I kind of breezed through as well.
Can I cut you off? How do you feel about that? Initially, when I heard that there was a manifesto, and again, that's within the 24 hours of the shooting taking place, I was on the fence. Would I want to see this manifesto if I could? Would I want it to be available? Like, what do you think about that? My knee-jerk reaction is no, don't make it available, for the fear that it radicalizes, like in the dark corners of the internet, that radicalize men such as that Hatfield guy from Alberta. But also, the devil's advocate in me thinks, well, it would be kind of interesting to see what he was chewing over and like what he is promoting. But I tried to read the 37-page document that was available, and it was even hard to get through. Like, what do you think? Should that be made available?
Yeah, I think that's a great like kind of like question. I think myself and the team were asking ourselves through like our editorial line is like, do we want like it's always the idea of like, what do we want to give a platform to, you know? And I think there is a reason that like many, I want to say like more like mainstream publications like CBC, Radio Can, CTV, like all those people seem not like a little wary to publish it, and that it came out through Rebel News, I think does show a sort of like, it does show a little, I think there is sort of a carelessness about it, where the concern is always activating those kinds of copycat things, because you'll see that very often among sort of like these like public shooters, is that they reference other public shooters. You know, it's sort of this kind of like, I mean, like I don't know, I don't want to call it some kind of league, but like there's clearly like they get activated by these things and they want to sort of like if they read these things and they feel similar thoughts, then they might be compelled to do so. I think one easy one to mention is the sort of anti-Muslim shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand, who directly referenced the Quebec City mosque shooter.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so I mean, there's often a thing about like I think the RCMP was very careful about releasing details about it early on because you want to avoid sort of that kind of catching fire. Just sort of the reason I wanted to talk about this, I think. With that distance of a month, let things cool down. I think there's always like, I mean, that's the thing with news, right? And that's the thing where we try to, I think sometimes take the approach of slow journalism, right? The thing was like, we want to take our time and be careful about covering these stories because there is sort of, I think, something that can be, the word that comes to mind is careless or inflammatory maybe about like trying to catch onto those hype trains and the kind of like peak of interest that comes out in the days after, because I think it's a lot of times those days where the narratives are going to come out and then those are going to like get hard set into people, and that there's like, are we adding to people's reactiveness or are we adding to thoughtful kind of discussion around it? And those are the things that run my mind, and that's why I felt a little more comfortable about letting things cool down, and I guess having you on a month after. Looking through I think one thing that's important to note about this screed, because even there's like some guidelines that people talk about being careful about calling it a manifesto, because it's like...
Good point, actually.
Calling it... No, yeah, and this is something I think I call it a manifesto sometimes too, but then I try to catch myself because there's a thing about calling something a manifesto kind of gives it a little more... Power than it might have, you know? And I think that is something I think does apply to this one as well, because you look through it and it's kind of like, it's very like formally structured. It's like verbose, he's like building this kind of like really intricate and like detailed web. And I think the structure of it can be... It has a structure of something very official, but then like if you like get down to the bottom of it, it's just like hating. This is misogyny, right? It's like misogyny with like lots of words and lots of like I don't know. It's like misogyny with a bunch of dog whistles and a bunch of kind of the appearance of intellectualism. Nora Loreto in her piece calls it a dog's breakfast of sort of like of sort of like this mismatched thing of ideas, right? Which is I think why it's important to denote, like, it's at the end of the day, it's like when we look at, I guess it's easy to look at the course of actions he took and then look back at the manifesto and be like, oh, did some real intellectual analysis lead to this, or was this is just like the ramblings of like, well, let's say just a person who's clearly unwell? It
was definitely ramblings based on the short Rebel News document that I saw. Definitely ramblings, and then backed up with horrific, violent action to almost like pedestalize his own ramblings. A dog's breakfast, exactly that. And it's almost interesting how you frame that, because it was structured and written in such a way that it seems to almost possess authority. Like the document itself has all of its correct citations. It's like very essay styled. It's almost positioning itself as something bigger than it actually is. Right. And then his actions with the shooting back that up as like, this is something bigger than it actually is. In a weird catch, it almost reminds me of so many facets of the manosphere itself. And when I've seen, like, from what I've seen behind the scenes, and this is where my own disillusionment comes into question, and where I almost wonder, like, are the men experiencing the disillusionment, or when will they, or how will they? There are so many gurus out there that, whether it's the incels that are hating them or like the other guys that are getting radicalized by them in the manosphere, who really purport themselves out to be something bigger or more authoritative or more important than they actually are. Behind the scenes, a lot of these guys are really just peddling random narratives in the manosphere to profit off of male loneliness or young men and their insecurities. And frankly, from the angle of being behind the scenes of a business model like that, it's unfortunately easy to do. And so I think it's kind of like poetic in a really tragic way that you have this document, this manifesto, quotation marks there, this manifesto that is sounds like, is looking like something more and more authoritative and more substantial than it actually is. And I think it's kind of almost like a facet of the manosphere itself. Like that is a lot of, it's smoke and mirrors in a sense. And just sadly, this ended up being a violent act, and it should never have been. And it looks like it gives the appearance of more power to the document and more power to his ideologies, but it's just needless, scared, disenfranchised young man who needed help. I don't know when, I don't know where in the timeline he needed help, but he definitely needed help.
Right. 25 years old, graduated high school in 2019, right before COVID.
That's the detail that stood out to me is, it's interesting how he graduated high school in 2019, right when the world was shutting down and like inhibiting resources of community for everyone, but especially people in that age group. It's a scary time already to be graduating high school. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of unknowns, many unknowns. And what do you do with them? Well, if the whole world locks down and everyone from any background, any age has never been through this before, well, imagine how like this little teenager would have felt. I'm not trying to have so much compassion for like the grown 25-year-old adult who made these decisions. But when I turn back the clock and look at that situation, like the teenage boy who just left high school and probably needs some community, some support, like some positive resources. Yeah, I feel bad for that archetype. I do.
Is that what you see with your clients that you try to help? Because just to, I guess, like set the scene again, like you still do this kind of work, but like now outside of the sort of, I guess the umbrella of that old company, right?
So what I was doing specifically work-wise with that company is working behind the scenes in the marketing department, which is why I do find it really interesting to have that behind the scenes disillusionment experience, because I also thought that these gurus at the time in the 2010s who were the like head dating instructors, I thought that they were just as cool as they purport themselves to be. But then of course I go behind the scenes and I get to see all of the illusion. Yes, exactly. And I understand, okay, so this is just my job. Like I just am a part of the marketing here, which was interesting for itself. But really what I found is we were largely identifying not just existing pain points that many young men share. I mean, that's the premise of marketing, but we're not just identifying it. We are really like working hard with our sales copy. And this is before ChatGPT. We're really working hard with our sales copy to exaggerate any possible pain points so that we could take and get more money. Now, the work that I presently do with people who do seek me out is not so much on the premise of getting or attracting women as the pickup artist would focus on. I do identify that that is a want. I do identify that that is an obvious desire and why some people come to me. But what I get them to focus on are identifying the value that's already existing within them, which like everyone has some source of value with them, and just how to bridge the gap of communication. Now, there's a lot of work, personal work that goes into that. And I probably have a personal bias. You know, while the pickup artists are saying, go out into the street and open all high volume approaches, really kind of expose yourself to those stressors. I'm saying, yeah, there's a time and a place for that, but it also helps to first feel good about yourself. Just good. It's not asking much, but actually for a lot of people, that's way easier said than done.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, you know, like before you mentioned, I think about the shooter, this sort of what you see as a potential lack of community, a lack of kind of community support, maybe a lack of direction that might have led to these kinds of frustrations. I imagine, do you deal with similar things among your clients, or how do you see them kind of like grappling with that?
Yeah, I do. Especially the people that I tend to work with are they're somewhere in their 30s, 20s, not so much, although I'll get some people in university. And usually my follow-up questions are, do you have friends? Like once I initiate a conversation with someone, like a prospect, if you will, who's interested in talking and receiving value from me, I ask, do you have friends and what do you do and how are you spending your time? So I have this young guy who thinks he's communicating with me because he wants to attract women. And yeah, sure, maybe I can help with that. But actually my initial follow-up questions are basically, what is your source of community? And if their answer is not much, maybe have one or two friends, which I think is great, by the way, like at the very least, maybe play a little bit of video games. I still think that's okay because it's something, like there is some community that can be found through video game playing within reason. From there, I'm usually giving them feedback to maximize their access to community. And I'll give some like very basic resources, such as like go check out a website such as meetup.com. You don't even have to go to one of these groups. You can just start to almost perform market research in your own personal life to expand your mind and see what's out there, what communities are out there. And from there, you can reverse engineer and figure out what you'd maybe be curious to experience. And sometimes the younger guys, they really meet me with pushback. Like, well, how does it help me get women? I'm like, well, I'm trying to present a holistic approach to actually enriching your life with things that are going on, things that are happening for you so that you could, again, develop your self-esteem, like to actually develop like a good self-concept. And it can help to do this through having access to community, other people who will hold you accountable to a good value system, a shared value system. And unfortunately, if you've ever looked through the dark corners of the incels, taking it back to this type of subculture, they have community. They have each other, but if you look at how they speak amongst themselves, this community is toxic. It's a lot of tearing each other down. And while the incels feel disempowered that like they involuntarily can't attract women, what is not accurate about this, if you pay attention to how they speak in their communities, they're all just hurting each other. The women didn't even know that these subcultures existed or what was going on. It's not on the women's radars. It's the men who are largely poisoning each other. That's not entirely true, but there is that huge aspect that I've noticed.
Toxic habits are sort of like reified among these kinds of communities.
Yes, so they have a community, but it's a toxic community. Yeah. So find community, but which one? I
think there's two really interesting things there that I think of after hearing that. It's sort of seeing this thing that's the male loneliness epidemic, right? That people love to talk about, and I do believe to some extent it's true, and I think that kind of and that doesn't only extend to men as well. I think there's that's just kind of happening abroad in society. There's a great good book called Bowling in America, and it's sort of about how this expanding loneliness. But this writer looks at kind of like these bowling clubs and how over the years they kind of diminished in these certain small towns in America. And then there's this thing of I don't know, it's hard to like, we're getting real philosophical here, well, I am, where to me it's this thing of like kind of the rampant individualism that like, let's say our society might like reward, right? And the things that might erode things like community. So when you're talking about that, I really enjoy hearing that the answer to the, in quotations, male loneliness epidemic is not necessarily women, but in fact, like community, right? It comes from a lack of community. But then I really enjoyed that stipulation about there's certain kinds of community that are toxic or that can be toxic, right? It's not just being in community that is like a natural go-to solution, right? Because like if toxic people are in community with other toxic people, guess what's going to come out of that, right? It's going to be a community that like elevates or when they see each other, the things that they share are going to be maybe these toxic traits, and then that becomes a thing that's like amplified. I think there's something really interesting about that to me that to me almost sounds like there, to me, a healthy community has a certain kind of like diversity of like, let's say like of people, of gender, of different like, just you have a variety of people, and sort of like a healthy, like in terms of like, if I borrow from like natural scientific terms, like a biodiversity among community. And when I hear about a community of incels, to me that rings more like a monoculture, right? Something that might be more like depleting of the soil. We're kind of running towards the end of the program here, but I'm kind of curious if you like what I mean. There's so much to talk about. We haven't even gone into to me. One of the things that really stood out about this screed was that it's the incel thing was something that was sort of applied to it, because there's actually, at least in this whatever like 30 odd page version that's out, there's no mention of the word.
You're right. Good point.
But it's clear. I think there's clearly a reason that people associate with it, right? Because I mean, like the things that we've been talking about very loosely here, about the things about how he blames women, these kinds of actions men should take. I think you pointed out something interesting about these kind of his sort of two-pronged, I guess, future that he sees for people who are facing these kinds of things. If you want to get into that, about either like bettering yourself or.
Yeah, I saw that allegedly a part of this document that he wrote, he did feel that men had only two choices, which is definitely not true and super reductive. And even we can look at it for itself. Here's what it is. A young man either has the choice of depression, loneliness, and attempted suicides, or to battle his commonness through routes of self-help, self-improvement. And when I see this, I think, okay, well, just this lens in itself is very telling, because even when my immediate thought, which is maybe a little unrelated, is just at some point we were all born like babies to toddler to child. Like there's sort of this continuous non-negotiable self-improvement aspect of our lives, whether we're putting a super deliberate effort into it or we're just existing. At some point, maybe sure, there's like degradation if you're not putting any work. And I guess that's when we go into the other prong of depression and suicide attempts, as he's alleging is the only other option. But in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what's so wrong with self-improvement in this sense? I think what's wrong with it is when we whip out terms such as like life coach and people who are profiting off of others' weaknesses. Well, in my mind, I think, what if we could just distill it down to principles of betterment? And when it comes to community, yeah, you could find these like toxic monoculture type communities that lack that biodiversity, as you're saying. And I feel like if that's going to happen, it's because it's some sort of reflection of self. And so what I would guide someone, for instance, someone who's talking to me and asking me some questions, I'm definitely pushing them in a direction of looking and diversifying based on their interests, based on something that's like innate and precious to them, something that they've maybe never given themselves permission to explore before, but to really like take certain risks in a positive sense, where you're actually exposing yourself to like, do I like doing this thing? Do I like these people? Do I like this book, whatever it is, and making choices of yes, no, yes. And from there, once you do enter into spaces with access to community, you have a whole plethora of ways to relate to those spaces. And you don't have to like fall back on this doomsday monoculture thought that is described in this document, that it's either this or that. No, why should it be that? And if it is, self-help is another prong that you're trapped to. What's the problem with that? Like that could go in so many positive or just good directions.
No, absolutely. I think we can wrap things up there if you don't have anything else to say. Where can people follow you, the work you're doing, the what would you call it, your special interests? Yeah,
special interest is the great way to put it. My brand, my everything is socialdynamicsnerd on every single channel. TikTok is one of them. Instagram could be one of them. YouTube will be coming. But most importantly, if anyone has actual questions or feedback, my email is spencer@socialdynamicsnerd.com. And that's also the website, socialdynamicsnerd.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Spencer, for coming on.
Thank you.
Just chatting with me on this. There's obviously so much that we weren't able to touch upon in this 30 minutes. It's a massive thing, but hopefully this has been helpful. And maybe I'm kind of curious, how do you, the viewer, the listener, understand this act of violence? Is there something that we miss? Let us know in the comments. Thank you very much for listening and watching.